Well, Malcolm, I am so glad to turn the tables on you from 2 years ago on this stage, where you were in the driver's seat. Watch out. So the place to start is to say that the first time I ever thought about writing a book was when I read your book, The Tipping Point. The first time I thought about making a podcast was when I was listening to revisionist history. I am really hoping that you don't start selling cigarettes. It'd be so interesting, nicotine. But I think that it's been amazing to see how you're able to animate social science and ideas, and I'm excited to talk with you about WorkLife. We've collected questions from lots of listeners. We'll talk about those. Before we do, I've got some questions and topics of my own. And I think it's worth pointing out that when we were talking about bonus episodes for WorkLife, we only had one idea the whole time, which was you. So here we are. We're grateful that you were willing to do this. And I will say that 2 years ago when we did this, a bunch of people reached out to me and said, do you guys not like each other?
Yes, I was quite mean to you.
I was told it was me.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Well, once I discovered that you didn't want to talk about your family, I asked you about your family. So.
Well, and I have the right to pull that card tonight, so stay tuned. But, I have to say, you're my favorite sparring partner in the sense that you really take joy in intellectual disagreement. I've discovered that I do too. And so my hope is that we will disagree on some things tonight.
Good. Yeah.
When we do, I hope you take that as a sign that I respect your opinion enough to want to change it.
All right.
And ideally, I will win more of these arguments than I lose.
Yes.
Is that fair on ground rules?
Sure. Yeah. No. I'm happy to lose arguments to you anytime you want.
Great.
Yeah.
We should do this more often. I'm so glad you're here. So the place I wanted to start is to say that when I think about work life, we both spend a huge part of our work lives thinking about human behavior and trying to understand it and make sense of it and maybe even make it a little bit better. And I think we're both in jobs that have a pretty strong monopoly on that, right, between journalism and social science. I'm curious, outside of our jobs, what you would say is the occupation that has the most insight into human nature and human behavior. Is there a career field or a kind of job?
Oh. Well, there are obvious ones. Teachers would be the first, and by extension, and then all of the professions attached to that. So, teachers, and then my brother was a principal. I always feel like in the position he's in, he's a principal of an elementary school, so he interacts with kids, their parents, and then the teachers who have to deal with the kids and the parents. And it strikes me that you have a very unusual and powerful lens on human beings particularly because parents are never more crazy than when they are interacting with the teachers of their children.
And wait, your own parents demonstrated that, if I remember correctly.
Oh, I don't think my parents were crazy when they interacted with the teacher. I think they were one of the few outposts of sanity in the educational system. They were indifferent to it, which I think is the preferred position of a parent.
So play that out for a second. I remember you telling me that you hatched a plan as a senior in high school to miss as much school as you could.
Well, no, it's more specific than that, and you're making me sound bad. No, having my best friend Terry and I were very competitive, but we decided that competing over grades was increasingly boring and too easy. So what we decided to do was we came up with our own metric. And the metric was your grade average, times the number of absences you had over the course of the year. So you could do two things. You could compete on the grade average, or you could compete on the absences. And of course, the much more fruitful multiplier of those two is the absences. And so.
But your mom gave you cover to do that.
So did his. The first thing we did was to recruit our mothers into this experiment, and they saw the wisdom of it immediately, and so Terry will probably disagree, but I seem to think I won. That he had a higher average and I had more absences, because my mother's backstory. This is my best friend growing up, and our mothers were very competitive. And I think I was quicker to understand that this was an important dynamic and one that could be exploited to my benefit. And so when I made it clear that if my mother wasn't wholly on board in this, I was going to lose to Terry, my mother was like, all right, what can I do? And so she would write me these notes that were, Malcolm will be absent, where the date was blank. And I would just fill in the date.
So for anyone who's ever wondered, how did Malcolm Gladwell become so subversive and contrarian? Blame his mother. I don't want to get too Freudian here. So you're going to nominate principals, teachers. My instinct was comedians. I think as a comedian, you have to understand not only what will make people laugh, but also what's right on the edge of making people uncomfortable. And that requires a lot of insight into the immediate reactions that your audience is going to have. And so I think comedians are master psychologists.
Oh, I
agree or disagree?
Totally disagree. Because...
Who invited you?
Think about this. No, think about this, Adam. I'm using the principal teacher as my model. You're using the comedian. The thing that's difficult about the teacher is that the teacher is dealing with people in a natural environment in real time, and there is an infinite variety in the circumstances and the kinds of people that they have to interact with. The comedian, by contrast, is dealing with people in a tightly controlled setting with a rich set of expectations governing their behavior, where they get to turn down the lights, dose everyone with alcohol, and create an expectation that laughter is the appropriate response to what they're doing. I cannot imagine a better set of circumstances, an easier set of circumstances for navigating a social situation than those.
So if that's true, when are you ready for your first stand-up performance?
I would, if you're asking me, that's not the right answer. The best question is, if you're asking me, would I rather teach a class of first graders or do a stand-up performance? And the answer is, I would do a stand-up performance 1,000,000 times before I would teach a class of first graders. Infinitely harder.
I cannot wait to present you with both options and see what you really choose.
By the way, how could you, it's not even close, by the way. Stand-up, one of the things that stand-up comedians do that drives me crazy is that they like to pretend that their profession is this terrifying, death-defying, high wire act. Have you ever given a performance before a group of people who have been drinking? Do you know how they are putty in your hands? It's like they're sitting there, they're dosed up with alcohol, waiting to be entertained. That is about as far as you can get from a room full of first graders as is humanly imaginable.
I think there's some truth to that. I also think, though, that the nice thing about kids is that the situations repeat over and over again. So you only have a certain number of ways that kids can misbehave and that parents can be difficult. And you get to practice over and over again the responses that you want to have. And over time, that becomes a skill, and it becomes expertise.
Wait, you don't think comedians practice over and over again?
Of course they do. Of course they do, but your audience varies so much, right? Try to give an improv performance in a new country for the first time.
Yeah, but they don't do that. They go to Vegas, and they go to the Comedy Cellar, and they go to,
You're hanging out with the wrong comedians.
No, that's my point. They control their environments. No one controls their environments better than comedians. That's how they manage to do what they do, right?
And so you don't think that still requires deep insight into human behavior or psychology?
Not deep insight.
No.
Talking to drunk people requires some insight, but it's not.
You may be doing it right now. It is really easy, it turns out. So let's shift gears a little bit. I want to talk about your work life. Mm-hmm. I think you go out of your way to write yourself out of your stories, for the most part. Mm-hmm. Out of your books, out of your articles. Occasionally you make a cameo on your podcast, which, by the way, season 3 is coming out, Revisionist History,
yep.
May 17th.
May 17th, yes.
Can't wait to binge and get behind on everything else I'm doing.
Good.
But what is your work life actually like? Like, how do you spend your time? What are your creative processes? What are your habits?
Let's think. Well, I just kind of work a lot. The work that I do requires, for example, let's talk about today. Today, I'm trying to figure out the 10th and final episode of my podcast, which is still very vague. So today, I spent a lot of time just kind of daydreaming isn't quite right, but kind of free associating in my mind about, I know a little piece of it, and the question is, what are the other pieces? And so I was just sort of imagining what the other pieces would be, and then noodling around online to find ideas, and then I talked to you in the green room, and you gave me like 2 fantastic ideas. So that's a very good day, you know.
Wait, so you're basically a teenager 3 days before a paper is due?
No, but the problem is that this is for a podcast, so that there's an extraordinary amount of planning that has to go into. So there's a guy in Toronto who's the general manager of the Toronto Maple Leafs who I would like to talk to for this show. So I emailed him, and he emailed me back. But now I have to figure out a time to go and see him. I mean, I got to go to Toronto. You know, there's all this kind of. So there's an awful lot of logistics that go into my day after I've figured out. But I don't think I've given you a very satisfactory answer.
No, you haven't. Your work life sounds pretty boring, actually, the way you describe it right now.
Well, there's not, you know, because if you think about it, so what is a book? A book is 75,000 words. In a good day, you should be able to write 1,000 words a day. So now we're not counting revisions and stuff, but so you should be able to do a draft of a book if you know what you're writing about in 75 days. Now that's absurd, of course. No one does a book in 75 days. But so this is what non-writers, I don't know whether they all appreciate this, the actual block of time you spend writing is only a tiny fraction of the work that goes into a book. In fact, it's probably the smallest fraction. So the rest of the stuff is what takes up all the time and energy, not the actual.
So Dan Pink told me recently that he loves being his own boss because he has the best boss in the world, but then he realized he has a terrible employee, which is also him. What is it like to work for Malcolm Gladwell, and what kind of boss are you of yourself?
Kind of boss? Well, I'm probably overly controlling. I don't know. I think that question is so absurdly meta. I don't think I can answer it. I think you're just having fun with that particular. I mean, Dan Pink has already stolen the best line. What kind of boss am I? I mean, I'm a nice boss to myself, I think.
So I'd love to hear a little bit about your creative process and where your ideas come from, how you develop them, and any insights for our audience on how to be a little bit more creative.
Well, you know, I did a episode of my podcast last year called The King of Tears, which is all about why it is that country music can do sad songs and rock and roll can't. And
that was really depressing, by the way.
Thank you.
All the music you played.
That was
like, I know why I don't listen to this stuff now.
But one of the points I made was something that I've believed very strongly for a long time, which is that country music can be sad when rock and roll can't, because country music is specific. And specificity is something I've become increasingly interested in as a trait of interestingness. That all the interesting people I know are people whose speech and thinking has a great deal of specificity to it. So I was listening, for example, to a podcast interview with Rostam Batmalglij, who's the...
Is that a person?
Yes. He's a brilliant musician who was one half of Vampire Weekend before they broke up. And I happen to know his brother, who's also a brilliant director. And they have the same quality. And it's funny because I was listening to Rostam speak and I was reminded of Zal, his brother, that they are extremely accomplished, but when they talk about what they do, there is this brilliant level of specificity. So they don't just say, I really loved that film by Alfred Hitchcock, which is what 90% of us would say. What Zal will say is, if you watch that film by Hitchcock, in the 30-second moment, there's this scene where this happens, and so says this, and the camera does this, and in that moment, you realize this, right? And Rostam did the same thing. He was talking about the song he'd written, and as he went through the song, he identified the points of his points of his influence, but he didn't just say, oh, that was from like a... he zeroed in on exactly the moment in the song from 1969 that he heard when he was a kid in high school in 1989, and and he was here when he heard it, and that guitar, and you realize that's why you listen to him, to the two of them, because they have this, and that quality of being specific and being able to illustrate your larger points with that kind of precision is the quality of what makes something interesting. And also ever since I've come to understand this, that has informed the way I look for ideas. So I'm trying to be as precise as possible in how I illustrate an idea, and to understand that in the service of illustrating an idea, you have the freedom to zero right in. You don't have to skate over you don't want to skate over the surface.
But isn't that what you've always done? Right? Like, here's a story about a statue, and oh my gosh, that changes your entire understanding of intuition. And here's a story about a hockey team or a soccer team, and all of a sudden, we're going to reimagine how success works and think it's much more luck and opportunity than we think.
Yeah, but I think I did it. I think I did it in the beginning without realizing that's what I was doing. So you asked me what my creative process is, and the answer is I've only recently become kind of conscious of it, and I realize, and knowing that is also, with a podcast, you have to crank up the specificity even more. So because now you're listening to somebody's voice, and they need to take you, in order to engage someone who's only experiencing this through their ears, you need to ramp up the precision. So I've had to think about that. Like I was interviewing this psychoanalyst the other day in the offices of the New York Psychoanalytic Institute, and the reason you go there and don't do the interview over the phone is that you want to know what the office of the New York Psychoanalytic Institute looks like, and you want to know how many busts of Freud there are in the room, because it's not going to be one, right? You know that it's going to be greater than one and less than what? I mean, could they have 10? It's entirely possible they could have 10. And so you go there and you're on the subway going, and you're thinking, good Lord, what's the number? If I had to bet, what would be the over-under on Freud busts?
I've often wondered about that.
And the answer is 5 busts, but there was a collage of Freud photographs where they had 16 photographs of him throughout his life. Now, if you want to add the photographs to the busts, we're at 21, right?
So what do you think it says about your psyche that this is what you're wondering about on your way there?
No, I'm wondering on that there because Adam, I was trying to answer your question, which was about my creative process. Well, one of the things that you have to ask yourself when you're on your way to interview for a podcast are those kinds of questions. I have to make the scene come alive of being in the New York Psychoanalytic Institute. So what are the ways that you do that? Well, one of the ways that you do that is you try and anticipate what's interesting about the New York Psychoanalytic Society, right? And that's one of the things.
So I have a different take on interestingness, which comes from a sociologist, Murray Davis, who wrote this beautiful paper decades ago called That's Interesting, where he said, ideas survive not because they're true, but because they're interesting. And you're like, that's interesting. This is bad news. Mm-hmm. But then he's kind of proving his point in a meta way. And then he says, well, what makes an idea interesting? He says, what makes an idea interesting is when it departs from conventional wisdom. If something just affirms your assumptions, you don't get curious. You don't get intrigued. There's no surprise. And you're like, boom, confirmation bias, all good. When you're interested is when you're like, that's the opposite of what I would have thought, or that's different from what I would have believed. And I don't think specificity gets you there. I think if you have a really specific story that confirms everything I always thought was true about the world, I'm not that excited. If you have a specific theory that I read a Malcolm Gladwell book generator once that created fake book titles of yours, and one of them that I remember was Nothing, What Sandcastles Can Tell Us About North Korea. Like, that's interesting, right? I'm like, wow, I never would have thought that a sandcastle could explain North Korea.
Yeah.
And so don't you think that specificity needs to be coupled with surprise?
Sure.
Good.
By the way, I don't think
I rest my case.
That guy's
Thank you all so much for coming.
That guy's theory of it, what's interesting, not terribly interesting. I mean, I'm assuming the article is more interesting than you're letting on.
I mean, yeah, so Davis then creates, this is the worst thing for a social scientist to do, but he creates a typology of the interesting. And he says there are all these different ways that you can challenge an assumption. But I think what is interesting is he says, but not all assumptions want to be challenged. And so an interesting idea is one that challenges your weakly held assumptions. Whereas if you challenge somebody's strongly held assumptions, they just say you're wrong or you're stupid.
Well, that's good. That's fun. Wait, this reminds me of, did you ever read Charles Tilley's book on reasons why?
Should I?
Yeah, because it's in the same, it belongs to the same universe as the paper you're describing. He describes all of the, he does a typology of reasons, which is super interesting, which he explains how there are different explanations we give for things, and the explanation has to fit the problem. And we get into trouble not when we don't provide an explanation, but when we provide the wrong explanation, right? So one explanatory strategy is a narrative. And if you provide a narrative in a case that calls for a theory, you're in trouble, or a fact. Anyway, he does. I just throw that out there because
I feel like I don't need to read it now.
No, you should. He was one of the great. He died a few years ago, but he was at Columbia. He was up here. Yeah, he was one of their great sociologists.
I'll take a look. Thanks for the tip. So you mentioned the idea of fit, and narratives fitting or misfitting the kind of explanation people are looking for. You've been working on the fit topic around questions of what does it take to be effective or successful or a high performer, and how much does my environment and whether I fit it matter? And I'd love to talk about that because I think there's some real dissenting opinions that need to be surfaced to correct the ones that you're going to potentially surface. So can you tell us first what you've been doing there?
Well, I wanted to talk about basketball because right now the NBA is this lovely little case study in fit, and there are all of these cases of. So to backtrack, basketball, the kind of intuitive position of basketball is it's the sport where talent matters most and coaching and organizational fit matter least. If you put LeBron on a team of also-rans, you can basically guarantee you'll make the playoffs. And he actually has made the finals several times with teams of. So it's like, it doesn't really matter who's with LeBron. You can put a bunch of stiffs and it's fine, right? In fact, the two greatest basketball teams of all time, the mid-90s Chicago Bulls, were three superstars and then two very ordinary players. Their fifth player was a big, slow, white guy from Australia. And if you look at the second greatest team of all time, or maybe the Warriors of 2 years ago, they were three superstars, and then their fifth player was a big, slow, lumbering white guy from Australia. Like, it doesn't matter. You could just go to Australia and get some random guy, and he could be your fifth. So, but what's happening now in basketball? There's a couple examples in this season that sort of go against that. One is that one of the best guards in the game this season was this guy named Victor Oladipo, who, before he moved to the Indiana Pacers, played on the Oklahoma, on OKC, and was considered a disaster. And he simply moves teams to a new environment with presumably a better coach. He's no longer playing with Russell Westbrook, who's probably a very difficult person to play with. And simply by moving teams, he went from being someone who was widely considered to be a bust, someone who would be washing out of the league soon, or a mediocre player, into this suddenly a superstar who's kind of playing transcendently. The reverse is also true, that the best coach in the league is probably Brad Stevens of the Boston Celtics.
I second that.
And every time a very promising player is traded from the Boston Celtics, they turn out to be terrible. Like, they just leave Boston and they go to another team and are like, oh, wait a minute, the guy, actually, Jay Crowder is a good example. Everyone was like, oh, Jay Crowder's really good. Oh, and then Boston trades him, like, oh, God, they traded Jay Crowder. Wow, I don't know if they can survive without Jay Crowder. Jay Crowder goes to the Cleveland Cavaliers, and all of a sudden people realize, oh, Jay Crowder's actually not any good. He just was good on Boston. And
there's another piece of, I think, evidence for your theory, which is this season they've lost their two biggest stars, and the first time they got better, and the second time they were way better than they should have been.
Yeah. So it's like, now, is this always true in basketball? I don't know, but we're certainly in this moment in basketball, it seems like it's very, very, very coach dependent. And when you see those, I've given a couple those specific anecdotal examples, you then begin to wonder how many players on basketball teams who we consider mediocre are actually really good, but just in the wrong environment. Is Victor Oladipo is he an exception, or is he part of a larger trend? And I'm increasingly of the opinion that there must be lots of Victor Oladipos out there.
I think there are, and I think they're not just in basketball. So this makes me think of Huckman and Pisano's study of cardiac surgeons, where you track their performance over the course of the day. And the question is, how many surgeries do they have to perform with, let's say, minimally invasive robot technology before they get to the point where they're up the learning curve? Mm-hmm. And I read in a book once that an average of 10,000 hours could be helpful. That does not turn out to be the case. Practice has no effect whatsoever in that context. And they are as deadly on surgery number 100 and 1,000 as they were on number 1. And this is weird, right? Because we're supposed to learn from experience. And so what Huckman and Pisano did was they broke down the data by which hospital you're performing surgery at. And they said, well, what's the effect of practice at hospital A on your performance at hospital A versus then hospital B? Mm-hmm. And they found that surgeries were hospital specific. So that every surgery I performed at hospital A, at least up to a certain point, reduced the patient mortality rate by about 1%. But then later that afternoon, as a surgeon, I would go over to hospital B, and it's like I'm starting over. And I have none of that experience. And the reason is I have a different team. Right, who knows my strengths and weaknesses, and we've developed a set of effective routines. And that kind of suggests that performance and skill and expertise is team-specific. It's context-specific. And then you see the same thing in financial services companies. There's this great Boris Groysberg et al. Study where they look at star financial analysts. And the question is, if they get poached by a different firm, what happens to their performance? And on average, it takes them 5 years to recover their star status, unless they take their team with them, in which case they show no dip in performance. Mm-hmm. And so that makes me think the people you surround yourself with really matter. Mm-hmm. Discuss.
Well, does this suggest that this is not a frivolous suggestion. What if when we hire people from competing organizations, we always hire the team? In other words, isn't it a lot more rational for me if I'm the University of Toronto and I want to poach Adam Grant, why don't I poach you and all of the colleagues who you think make you as good as you are? Or it probably works better in a non-academic context, but I'm surprised
I've been looking for an excuse to move to Canada, so.
Yeah, particularly recently. But why, in a business context, this would make even more sense. Why isn't it routine for businesses to try and
it should be.
Hire the group?
So 2012, I was asked to speak at a Google event. I walked in and Larry Page was on stage. How do you follow that? And they told me they wanted me to explain how I would run Google as an organizational psychologist. What would I do differently? And this is exactly the point I made to them. Is I said, if you look at your greatest innovations from the Google search engine, all the way across a few more recent ones, they've almost all been a dyad or a team. And yet, you hire individuals, you reward individuals, you promote individuals, you fire individuals. What if you did what Groysberg calls a lift-out? And you hired entire teams, which you sometimes see in tech and acqui-hires. But you didn't just do that, you promoted teams. You rewarded teams, and when a team failed, you fired the whole group as opposed to the individual. And they got really excited about it, and then they did the math of how much work it was going to be to keep a team together. And they said, this is just not practical. And so instead, they said, we're going to study what makes our teams great, and then try to create more of those conditions so that anyone can join any team and become great. But I'm a big fan of this.
Wait, does what they wanted to do make any sense? Or does that sound like a Silicon Valley cop-out?
No, I think it makes a lot of sense. So what they realized was they have some teams that are high-performing, maybe despite that shared experience. Mm-hmm. And they wanted to figure out what were the conditions that accelerated you up that curve. And so they found, I'm sure you've seen the research.
Wait. Having observed that teams outperform individuals, they said that they would, rather than use teams, just study the individuals in the team.
No. So they wanted to study the qualities of great teams.
Yeah.
And how to enable any team, even if they hadn't shown excellence together, to reach that level of success. Which I thought was reasonable.
Okay. It seems insanely convoluted in the way that those guys, it's not enough to take a very simple idea that a team that is observed to work well should be kept together and continue to work well. They instead want to kind of abstract out the quality and recreate it over there.
Yeah, I think they're.
You see what I'm saying? Like,
I
there's a
definitely
certain
see what
point
you're
where
saying.
people get so smart that the obvious thing is no longer satisfactory. They're like, no, Adam, I can think of a way that's way harder and way more complicated and ultimately might work as well. I think we should do that way.
Definitely. No, look, I think there are two complications. One is to push it to a further extreme. Over 75% of airline accidents happen the first time a crew is flying together.
Yeah.
And the evidence goes so far on this that NASA did a simulation showing that if you had a crew that was well rested flying together for the first time, they made more errors than a sleep-deprived crew that had just pulled an all-nighter but had flown together before. And you talk to airlines about this, and you say you should force, right, pilots to work together. And they're like, logistically, we can't do it. Like, there's no way to organize these flight mapping schedules so that everybody is always together. And that, I think Google has a version of that challenge, right?
Yeah.
As do most companies. The other challenge, which I think in some ways is bigger, is that like everything else in life, this is curvilinear, and there's such a thing as too much shared experience. So in the NBA, teams max out on probability of success around 3 or 4 years together. And then once they have more than 4 years of shared experience, their odds of winning go down. And maybe they're just getting old, the players, by that point. But a lot of it seems to be routine rigidity. And that you become more predictable, you stop innovating, you stop adapting, and other teams can develop ways to defeat you. And so, I'd worry a lot about saying, hey, we've got a really successful team, let's just go, let them, be great until they suck.
Yeah.
So, are you on board with what Google did?
Sure. I mean, I don't know enough. I find those organizations so puzzling because the thing about Google is that they have a business model, a relatively simple one, which generates an enormous pile of cash, and which allows them to do all kinds of other things that don't necessarily make any sense. So it's really hard to judge them about what they're doing, because they're like, well, they could basically just sit on their hands for the next 20 years, and they have so much cash it wouldn't matter, right? Like Apple, there's so much in the bank, they could just go on a vacation and come back in 2035, and they would still have a lot of cash lying around, and people would still be on their iPhones. So it's like, so if we say, well, Apple's done a really good job with X and Y, I'm like, well, I mean, yeah, if you give me $240 billion, I think I can do a pretty good job on X and Y. So I
think that's a fair point. Slack capacity is a pretty hard alternative explanation of success to argue with. I do think, though, that there's some interesting questions this raises. So if we go back to the idea of fit, and we say, all right, so we know that people perform better with a team they understand well or a team that they fit into. The natural extension of that is to say, okay, when I go into a company, or any workplace, I've got to assess their culture. I've got to figure out what the people are like. It might be values, personalities, skill sets. And I want to go join a place where I belong. And I guess two questions for you. The first one is, how do you recommend doing that? Mm-hmm. And then secondly, what do you think are the problems associated with it?
Well, so it's funny, because I have an episode of my podcast this season where I deal with this question quite explicitly. And it's all about a very brilliant military guy who goes into, at a crucial moment in this country's history, goes into government service and works for, I say, non-military government service. One of the weird things about military guys is that when they refer to the government, they don't refer to the military, like as if the military is not the government, which I always find quite charming. So he goes into a standard Washington bureaucracy as a Marine Corps guy. And what happens is mayhem, in a certain sense. He's too good for the job. They've never had someone. So one thing he does, I don't want to give too much away, but one of the things he does is he realizes his predecessor had never left Washington. And this is an agency that has far-flung operations all over the world. And he's like, that's crazy. And he then visits absolutely every one of the 400 field offices of his organization in 3 years, at the same time as he gives 250 speeches, testifies before Congress, writes hundreds of articles, just because he's a Marine Corps guy, and that's what they do. They're in a hurry, they're really super organized, they're busy, and they don't do a job unless they're going to do it well, right? That is not the way what bureaucracies work, and for good reason. You don't want bureaucracies run by Marine Corps guys. The worst thing that can happen if you're in a bureaucracy is that the bureaucracy gets really, really good. right? That is the end of freedom as we know it. The thing that saves it, and I don't mean this, I'm not being funny, I'm being dead serious. Our liberties are imperiled by overly competent bureaucrats, right? So this guy who's like super, super competent is just a tragic misfit in a standard Washington bureaucracy. Now, why doesn't he learn, why doesn't he adapt? Well, he could adapt, I think, if he'd left as a 35-year-old Marine Corps colonel. Do they have colonels in them? I don't know. But he leaves at 62, and he was the commandant of the Marine Corps, so he really hit the lessons of his Marine Corps-iness was ingrained in his. But so I think that was at that point in his career, it's more problematic than it would have been earlier. And I think government service is a really good example of this because it's the culture of government service is so specific and in some ways so counterintuitive that, we persist, for example, in this country in thinking that business success is a useful predictor of political success. And it's not. It couldn't be more different, right? The kind of skills you need to navigate the political process are not the ones you learn running a company.
David Winter has a bunch of data on that, and he shows that achievement motivation predicts success in business but failure in politics. Because people who are motivated to achieve mastery and excellence, they depend a lot on personal control. And they get wildly frustrated going into government where you have no personal control. It turns out in that world, power motivation seems to function more effectively, where if what drives you is the chance to have influence and impact, that you can figure out how to make that system work to your advantage. And so I think that underscores the argument, right? Business success is not political success.
I once heard Donna Shalala say that the only job that correctly prepares you for being president is being a college president. Because it's the same, think about what a college president does. They have a large group of completely independent academics who basically thumb their nose at you at every turn. And then they have...
What are you trying to say?
Exactly. You can't really do much. You can sort of push them in a very general direction. And then you spend the rest of your time sort of dealing with, fundraising, right? Which is actually a very similar kind of, what is fundraising? It's the lobbying a president might do in Congress is essentially what a college president will do with a donor group. Didn't you use earlier the phrase donor cultivation to describe what you were doing earlier this evening?
It's entirely possible that I was asked to engage in that behavior. Yes.
Well, donor cultivation is a political job. A CEO never engages in donor cultivation, right?
Yeah, although I think you do some of that when you seek out investment and when you navigate conversations with the stock market, right? But I take your point. I think where this gets tricky for me is if we go back to your Marine guy, I would say there's a study that Chad Hartnell led that was published recently, which showed that the more you misfit, the more you contribute. And so if you were to read an organizational culture, we could distinguish them on task versus relational values. Right? So task-oriented organizations are high efficiency, high productivity. They're all about getting stuff done. Relational organizations are much more community-oriented. They're all about family, and they're independent. You could be high on both, but oftentimes organizations that maximize on one don't the other. And what Chad found is that if you bring a leader into the C-suite, if the organization's culture is more task-focused, the relational leader actually adds more value because they're not redundant. And so, I would say the Marine guy is exactly, right? The commandant is exactly who you want to put into government because he's providing something that is sorely lacking.
Yeah, except in this, I should have added, in this specific instance, the policy that he was enacting, that he was so brilliantly enacting, was a terrible policy. In other words, it works really well when you know when you give, that task-oriented person orders that make sense.
Right.
In this case, we gave him orders that made no sense.
Got it. And so I guess, there's a paradox here, though, which is, we're all happier and more comfortable in organizations that fit our values. And yet sometimes it's the ones that diverge or clash where we can contribute the most or differentiate ourselves the most. How do you think about resolving that paradox? And you're writing a book about how we gauge strangers. How do you think about sizing up a new organization, a new culture, a new workplace, a new boss?
Well, we were discussing this a little bit before, but I think that we undersample new situations. we make up our minds far too quickly, and we're pressured to make up, a better way of saying, we're pressured to make up our minds far too quickly. I don't know why we would logically expect that someone ought to be able to size up a new organization over the course of a bunch of lunches with managers there who are interviewing you. That seems silly to me. I happen to be a big car nut. I love cars. And one thing I have found is that you can't size up a car on a test drive. It's the most ridiculous thing in the world. So you're about to spend an enormous sum of money on a car, and you go for the test drive, and the test drive is basically they go around the block with you. And then you say, well, can I spend more than 30 seconds in this car before I drop $40,000 on it? They're like, well, blah, blah. They give all these reasons. It's nonsense, right? It's almost as if they're afraid of you actually driving the car before purchasing it, which is a very odd position for an automobile salesman to take, that they are, they are anxious about you having too much experience with their product before you buy it. So there's and they don't seem to think this is a problem. They seem to think that if you just sit in the car, you can somehow intuit, all that's good and bad about that automobile just by.
I really enjoy how much this bothers you.
Oh, it drives.
It's a car, right? If this were like you can only go on 3 dates with someone before you're allowed to decide whether you want to marry them, I get getting upset. But this is a car. Who cares?
What do you drive? You're driving like.
I'm not entirely sure.
You're like a Hyundai. You got like a Hyundai from.
I've never driven a Hyundai, but a car is solely function. It gets me from one place to another.
Well, to my point, yeah.
I don't care how it drives. Yeah.
Do you really not know what? Come on, tell us. What are you driving?
I actually am not entirely sure what it is. My wife picked it out. My wife loves cars. She picked it out, and I drive it occasionally.
Interesting. All right.
So many conversations we could have right now. But before we get to some of the audience and listener questions, there are a couple quick things I want to ask you about.
Wait, we're not done here yet.
No, we're not. Are we going to talk more about cars?
No.
Okay, good.
I do want to talk about the sampling thing.
Yeah.
So here's my question to you. So let's remove all other considerations. Hypothetical world. You're hiring an academic to join the faculty of the psychology faculty at Penn. And you would like to give them, what do you think is the optimal sampling period for both parties to know that they're in the right place?
Do I get to read all their papers and their teaching evaluations first?
You can do, I'm talking about time.
Sure.
Yeah, you get to read everything you want first. You do your normal due diligence, but how much time do you need with that person? How much time do they need with you to understand that it's a good fit?
I'd probably want a semester trial period, which is why we have people take sabbaticals at other people's schools before we make decisions to hire them.
So you do think you have adequate time?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I do. And every once in a while you get fooled by a school that says this person is really great and they're just trying to get rid of them.
How often does that happen?
I mean, that's mostly with rookie hiring, where or junior faculty hiring. But nobody makes a senior hire without spending real time with that person first.
Wait, do you guys do that?
We've had people come out. Yeah.
Pretending that you think someone's great. So
No.
you get rid of them.
No,
You seem very enthusiastic about the strategy. That's why I asked.
No.
It seemed like something that was near and dear to your heart.
No, I was actually amused by the fact that at some level, that people think this is not going to come back around to catch up with them, right? So I used to feel like when I wrote recommendation letters, it was my job to advocate for the student or the candidate. And over time, I found that people thought I was too enthusiastic or too positive, and I had to differentiate more. And so I wouldn't write a negative letter about somebody that I didn't think was amazing, but I would have a clear distinction between somebody that I thought was the best person that I'd ever taught versus somebody that I remember their name from my classroom vaguely.
Yeah.
And I think that those distinctions matter a lot. But go back to the sampling. So how long do you want with someone, and how are you vetting them, and vice versa?
How long?
Because you hire people.
Well, I hire assistants. Yeah,
you have assistants who work for you.
I've been very lucky with them. There's only one I ever got rid of before, because it didn't work out. What happened was that I had a very unusual experience with my second assistant, which was it very rapidly became clear to me that she was a bad assistant But it also, at the same time, became clear to me that she was a wonderful person and so deeply hilarious that she couldn't even send an email that wasn't an absolutely brilliant piece of work that would reduce you to, helpless scales of laughter. And so that really changed my perspective on hiring, because I was like, was I willing to give up competence in her job for the delight of reading her emails? And the answer is absolutely. So I was like, as long as they have bringing something interesting to the table, I'm happy.
I do feel like the record needs to show that you just said she was brilliant because she was hilarious. So I stand by my comedian point from earlier.
She was a stand-up comic. She was an assistant. I mean, there's a big difference.
Same skill. All right, a couple other things I want to ask you about. One, building on this, if you were the CEO of a large company, what are the first policies you would either kill or create that would change the way that work life is experienced in your organization? So you get to design the perfect company. What's different from how most workplaces run?
Oh, that's super interesting. Well, way back in Tipping Point, I wrote about this whole idea of keeping groups under 150. And I thought a lot about that since, and I do think that I would try and keep sections of the company small and independent, under 150 if possible. I just think people enjoy themselves much more when they know everyone that they're working with, and when there is that extra element, when there is that social bond, in addition to kind of formal things, keeping people together. That's just much more powerful. I would take people's physical health far more seriously. I think that it sounds very Scandinavian, and
why did you say that pejoratively?
Well, because if you're Canadian and you grew up in the 70s and in the 80s in Canada, there was one of the principal advertisers in Canada is the Canadian government, and which is unusual because it doesn't happen here. And what the Canadian government used to do, far more actually in that period, is that they would have all of these. They would buy all this time on the radio and TV to make certain arguments about how we could be better Canadians. And invariably the arguments about being better Canadians involved holding up the Scandinavians as a role model. So they would always tell us that, well, the Swedes live, 4 years longer than the average Canadian. Or the Norwegians are running, 20 miles a week, whereas the average Canadian runs barely at all. I mean, they're always like, so I was, as a kid, constantly walking around with this kind of vague anxiety that I was not living up to the Scandinavian model.
Secretly, those ads were funded by the Scandinavian government.
But with the passage of time, I've come to look more fondly on that. And I still think they have a lot of things right. If you go to Amsterdam and everyone's cycling to work, and you just think, how fantastic is this? And the thing is, it works because everyone's doing it. All of our problems with cycling to work have to do with the fact that we don't want to be the only person on the road cycling, right? But once everyone's cycling, it's fine. And that's sort of what they've understood in Amsterdam.
We call that biking in America, by the way.
Really? We don't call it cycling? Oh, no. Cycling is
the racing thing, right? Biking. But go on.
I once had dinner with my Dutch publisher, who was a woman in her 60s, and it was March, and at the end of dinner, she disappeared into the bathroom and emerged in a wetsuit. I was like, where are you going? And she was like, well, I'm cycling home now. And she...
Underwater?
No, I mean, when I say a wetsuit, I mean like a full-on kind of zip up. And she got on a bicycle and she rode 8 miles through the rain home. And she did that every day. I just thought that was so fantastic. Anyway, were I CEO, I would like to somehow... I just think people are much happier when they get a chance to regularly exercise, and sadly most people's schedules don't allow for that.
So as an avid runner, what does that look like? Does your company have exercise breaks built into the day?
My company's clearly not going to make a lot of money since we're going to be working out a lot. But
you'll be really fast though, and really healthy.
Far be it for me to hold up Joyce Gladwell as an example of, that's my mother, as an example of work life. because my mother had a very unique perspective on work, which was it never occurred to her that the point of work was to make money. She had a whole list of things that came first. But one of Joyce Gladwell's great observations was that whenever she got a job, as she had in the second half of her career, the first thing she would do is she would go to her boss and she would say, look, I know I could work full time, but it's pointless. I can get, if you let me work, half time, I can get just as much work done, and I'm going to be happier, and you're going to be happier. And they would always agree after she pointed out that this was, and I think she's kind of right, that much of what people do can be accomplished if they are happy and well rested, and can be accomplished in some fraction of the time they currently spend on the job. So I'm not sure whether my company loses money. I think it probably makes a nice amount, and it's a reasonably productive place.
Sounds reasonable, and I now know why you skipped school.
Yeah, we don't put the time in the Gladwell family.
Clearly.
My father, this is a true story. My father, a mathematician, once was offered a job at Yale, and so he left for the weekend to go for the week to visit Yale, spend a week there. Came back, and we were all on pins and needles. We'll be moving to New Haven. And he said, so, he said, what was it like? He was like, no, it's not happening. I was like, we're like, why? You didn't like Yale? Yale, famous place. He goes, I got in there at 9 o'clock. They were all at their desks. I left at 5. They were still at their desks. We were like,
this is not going to work.
No.
Well, with that, all right, so let's take some listener and audience questions. I think we can do some of these as a bit of a lightning round.
Okay.
So we can get through as many as possible. This is from Kelly. She wants to know how often you assess your career goals and how your goals have changed over time.
I don't know if I have career goals. Just to be left alone, and basically.
I can't let that one go. You've made these shifts in turns, right? So you started a podcast. You were writing a TV pilot at one point. You must be trying to accomplish something in terms of your influence and the way that you spread ideas. There's not a goal there?
Well, I don't want to get bored. I think. I mean, it's serious. I don't know if there's anything more than that I'd like to try. The podcast was I wanted to try something new. The screenplay was I wanted to try something new. The writing books was I wanted to try something new. I left the Washington Post to do magazine writing because I wanted to try something new. I mean, I wasn't unhappy in any of those places, but I just thought, in fact, the most fun I ever had in a job was, well, not most fun, was at the Washington Post. Hugely fun, but at a certain point, you realize, well, there's more to life than just this, right? So you should try something else.
All right, Sean wants to know, I recently started a new job, and I'm curious when it's appropriate to begin disagreeing or expressing a different opinion.
Why don't you answer that, Adam?
Why don't you answer that?
Well, how would I know? I haven't had a job in years. The principle that guided the one time when I had a job at the Washington Post, I felt that the best way to be at work was deeply passive-aggressive. That is, that you should never express your disagreement in a straightforward way. You should rather quietly and in a kind of behind-the-back sort of way make your feelings known. So one of the things that I felt...
You are such a disappointment to adults.
This was the most important thing I did at Washington Post was I realized very early on that the way to make sure that you were given assignments that you liked was to never do a good job with assignments that you didn't like. And this
Yeah,
rule,
this is called strategic sloppiness.
This is so routinely violated by people. So at the Washington Post, we had an editor who was obsessed with weather stories. If there was a hurricane, he wanted to send 20 people there. And nothing is less fun than covering a hurricane. And so the hurricanes would come and we would be sent out en masse. And I could see, I was no dummy, I could see what a trap this was, because there's like 2 or 3 major hurricanes a year. They last, I mean, some of them you can spend 2 weeks in like some storm-ravaged town in South Florida. Like, this is just no part of this sounds interesting to me. So I was assigned, there was a hurricane that was hitting the Outer Banks of North Carolina and it was centering on a town on Columbia, North Carolina. You can see what's coming. Where did I go? Columbia, South Carolina. And I called in and I said, sun's shining here. I don't know what you guys are talking about. And then when they got angry, I was able to use my trump card, which was, I'm Canadian. I didn't know there was two Columbias. Who knew? What?
Wow.
Who thought it was a good idea to have, by the way, think about this. Who thought it was a good idea to have a Columbia, North Carolina, and a Columbia, South Carolina? Is there such a shortage of names of cities that before they separate the two Carolinas, they're squabbling over who gets to use Columbia? Like, there's a short list, and like, Columbia's on the list, and like, the whole thing's ridiculous.
There's a real contradiction here in that a minute ago you said you really don't put in the time. And yet, when I wanted to not be handed, tasks that I thought were not a good use of time, like sitting on a committee to determine furniture purchases, I just let it fall to the bottom of my priority list and didn't do a good job at it. You traveled to a different city in a different state
I know.
to get out of doing the job that you didn't want to do.
The thing is, you had to make a statement. So it's not enough to be kind of, if I was just kind of routinely incompetent, fine, they can deal with that. They have routinely incompetent people on staff. They would just throw me back into the fire the next time there was a hurricane.
So this is extreme incompetence.
I need to be spectacularly, like, they need to think, Gladwell doesn't even know where North Carolina is. We can't send him out to do hurricane coverage. So it was like, I thought a lot about that one before I pulled that particular stunt.
I feel so proud to know you right now. So another question is, this is a very interesting question about work-life balance. We have an audience member who said that a friend of hers did a doctoral dissertation showing that if you use the language work-life balance, people can become more upset with their work-life lack of balance. Because it evokes this image that I'm supposed to have everything juggled perfectly, and nobody's life is like that. Mm-hmm. And she found that if you reframe it as work-life management, people like it better. Because it sounds like a work in progress that I'm always navigating. Mm-hmm. Do you have other tips for how to think about that and make sure that work doesn't take over your life?
Oh, I don't know. I have no idea. Isn't this squarely in your wheelhouse?
Stop trying to turn it around on me.
I don't know. No, I'm not the right person to ask that question.
Then I'm going to move on. So we actually did an episode of WorkLife on this question, which is on when work takes over your life. And so I attempted to answer it, but I think it left many questions unanswered. Different question. This is from Brad. If blue-collar jobs are replaced by AI, how do you stay relevant as a worker?
I wonder whether are blue-collar jobs the ones that are going to get replaced by AI, or are white-collar jobs the ones that are going to get replaced by AI? That would be my first question.
Go on.
Because I keep hearing really interesting predictions that focus more on the displacement of cognitively complex. So if you think about, there was a great article in the New York Times by someone saying, autonomous vehicles don't put truck drivers out of work because truck drivers do a lot more than drive trucks. Mm-hmm. They do a whole bunch of personal tasks that require a person that a machine can't do. So the actual driving part is just some small. So what you might have is a situation where you have a human in the truck, only the human's not driving all the time. Mm-hmm. But you still need the human. Check on the cargo, make sure the truck is working properly, meet with the person when they're picking, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But if a lawyer is doing document search, that seems to me really straightforward for AI.
You're just trying to eliminate lawyers?
No, not at all. But I know that lawyers are quite worried about it, and I think appropriately. So how does one stay relevant? I think the answer is that you just need to be good. The obvious answer is good at the things the machine is not. I'm not an alarmist about AI. I happen to think that there are so many things that we need people to do that are not being done right now, that mostly that involve communicating with them and empathizing with them and helping them out, that some displacement in some areas is not the end of the world. It just means that we'll be able to focus a lot more on people who are in need of help.
That is what some of the job growth trends suggest, that nerds and nurses are showing explosions. And a lot of that is about communication, critical thinking, empathy. So I think that resonates. This one's anonymous. The question is there anything that you've written in the past that you would like to rethink or set the record straight on that maybe you were wrong about?
Oh, yeah. How could there not be? I always like to point out to people that my first book, Tipping Point, was written in 2000. So think back to your life in the year 2000. What about your life in the year 2000 do you think now, with the benefit of hindsight, was a good idea? So what were you wearing in the year 2000? I know what I was wearing. I wouldn't wear things I was wearing in the year 2000, like in a million years. What was what was the music you were listening to in the year 2000? In retrospect, not very good music, right? I've moved on. In every way, my life is different and better. So why would I expect the things that I wrote in the year 2000 to be things that I still agree with? So I don't actually like to reread a lot of the old stuff because I don't believe it anymore. I just don't.
For example?
Well, this is the answer I always give to this question, which comes up quite a lot, is the stuff on crime and a tipping point, I just don't.
The broken window theory?
Yeah, I don't find it persuasive at all anymore. Just because I know a lot more, and I think we know a lot more. At the time when I was writing that book, the crime drop in New York was 2 years old and 3 years old. We were in the middle of it, and we had no idea why it was dropping. So we were throwing out random theories. Now we have a better understanding of. So I wouldn't even come close to writing that the same way today.
Stuart and Dave both submitted basically the same question, which is, you wrote about Enron a long time ago. What lessons did corporate America fail to learn from that debacle that we're still in need of learning?
Well, there's so much fun about the Enron case.
I'm sorry, you said fun?
Yes. Fun thing number one which is the thing that I wrote about at the time. Well, I wrote 2 Enron articles. The second one was better than the first. In the second one, I pointed out that Enron was an example of a scandal in which everything that was used to bring down Enron was material in the public record put out by Enron. In other words, to know what Enron was doing wrong, all you had to do was to read the material that Enron had given to the public on what Enron was doing. And the reason it took so long to bring Enron down is that basically no one ever read the stuff they were putting out. Now, this raises a really interesting question. If everything that was used to end Enron was based on stuff that Enron told us, then what did Enron do wrong? So basically, if you think that Enron was a fraud, and you say, I know they're a fraud, because here in their 10Ks, they detail all the crazy things they're doing, but they told you they were doing crazy things. So what's your case? Why were you buying the Enron stock if Enron told you they were doing crazy things? Maybe you didn't read the 10K, which you're supposed to do if you buy a lot of Enron stock. So it gets very confusing. It's not the same, in other words, as the woman the woman who runs Theranos, what's her name?
Elizabeth Holmes?
Elizabeth Holmes. So there's now a case against Elizabeth Holmes. That's very different. So she was pretending to do X, and in fact we think, doing Y. That's fraud. But if I tell you I'm doing Y, and then I do Y, and you say, wait a minute, you did Y, you should go to jail. That's confusing.
So as long as I tell you, so if I tell you I'm going to defraud you, you're okay with it?
Well, no, I'm not saying I'm okay with it. I'm saying it's a different kind of crime. And it's one that I don't really understand anymore. I'm used to the model that the con man is trying to con me. Right. I'm not used to the model where the con man says before he cons me, here's how I'm going to con you, right? Yeah. And the other thing is that Jeffrey Skilling, is he still in jail? He may still be.
I think so.
So Skilling's crime, if you look very close to it, is that he believed his own PR. So he had this extravagant vision for how Enron was going to take over the world, and he believed it. And he went around and told everyone his extravagant vision. I don't think we have any evidence that he was consciously deceiving anyone. He was just a little bit deluded, right? Now, is being deluded, if you're someone who creates an entrepreneurial enterprise, a crime. I would argue that all entrepreneurs are on some level deluded. And we know that about them. If we're at all prudent, we know that when the founder of an entrepreneurial enterprise tells you their enterprise is going to change the world, you should really take that with a grain of salt. What you shouldn't do is say, oh, you are going to change the world, and when the world doesn't change, drag them before a judge and say, he promised me the moon, I never got the moon, right? How about saying the moon isn't something that you can promise somebody? Anyway, I just think that was I remain a skeptic about that particular.
That's fair. Doug wants to know what actions you recommend young professionals take to shape an organization, even though they might not be in charge yet. And I feel like we need to disclaim that we don't necessarily want to follow your career advice. But what advice would you give on that?
You want to change an organization?
A culture you don't like, a policy you think is broken?
Not be passive aggressive, I'm guessing. It's a good question. I don't know if I have a good answer to that. I don't know if I have a good answer to that. I sort of think that, when I think back at my time in a large organization, Washington Post, the thing that was most frustrating to me was the extent to which people over time in an organization put the needs and desires of those on the inside ahead of the needs and desires of those who they're serving. So there was a famous case of a very, very brilliant reporter who was fired from the Washington Post because he was difficult to work with. But there was very little understanding of the fact that what made him a brilliant reporter was the same thing that made him brilliant to work with, or difficult to work with, and that if you fired everyone who was difficult to work with at the Washington Post, you wouldn't have a newspaper anymore. You would. And I thought it was odd that an editor didn't consider it as part of their job description, the ability to work with difficult people, right? That's why you do that job. And that's what makes you good, is at that job. And then there's a point at which sometimes people get so kind of immersed in their environment that the reader who you're supposed to be serving falls away, and you just think about what would make your life better. So I guess in answer to that question, one simple way is to keep reminding yourself and those around you what the point of your organization is, who you're serving.
Last question. When you came out with David and Goliath, I remember talking and I was thinking that you wrote this book about underdogs because you love to root for the underdog. And you said no. And to this day, I'm surprised and puzzled about why, and I'm hoping I can get to the bottom of it. Why do you root for the favorite?
I believe that's the only truly empathetic position to take. And that
you're right. I feel a lot of empathy for the New York Yankees.
Rooting for the underdog is a form of moral weakness, and I'll explain why. So you have two people are competing. One person is expected to win. One person is not expected to win, right? If the person who is not expected to win doesn't win, they're mildly disappointed, but not massively disappointed because they didn't expect to win. If the person who is expected to win doesn't win, they are massively disappointed because the gap between their expectation and reality is enormous. They're suffering. They go home devastated. Their lives are over. They want to give up everything. They go through a massive soul searching. They wander off into the desert without water or food. Their lives are living hell. If you are a truly empathetic person, where does your sympathy lie? With the person who's like, well, I didn't win, but I wasn't going to win anyway, so what's the point? Or is your sympathy with the person who is wandering helplessly through the desert without benefit of food and water because they lost something that they had every expectation they would win? Where's your heart, Adam? You're like, oh, I'm going to go with the underdog.
No, Malcolm, that is so sick and twisted. Sick and twisted.
Callous.
There's so much wrong with your reasoning there. I don't know where to start. So, first of all, I will grant you the point. Tim Urban's here in the audience, and he has this great equation that says happiness is reality minus expectations. And that's true. And so I think you're absolutely right that the favorite is going to be more disappointed if they lose than if the underdog loses. But what you're not accounting for is all the joy the favorite had the last 5 times the Patriots won the Super Bowl. So I don't have a lot of empathy for Tom Brady. He still has his 5 rings. He still has his chin, right? He's going to be fine. Whereas the Eagles, suffering through many, many years of almost being great. No, it's not about the Eagles.
This is just about the Eagles.
It's a recent and salient example.
It all comes back to
as a native anyway. But think about the fact that Tom Brady has a whole bank of joy built up over decades. And poor Nick Foles has been struggling his whole career, and he gets to catch a touchdown pass in the Super Bowl.
You can't reconfigure the kind of principles of human psychology in service of your own Philadelphia inferiority complex. That's essentially what's happening here.
You are on home turf. This is not fair. But no, I could play this story out for any group, right? The teams that have won, the individuals that have already been on top, they have already enjoyed the fruits of experiencing that.
Here's the problem with this.
Don't you? Wait a minute. Hold on. You claim to believe in social justice.
Yeah.
You do. And so you basically want to maintain inequality and just let the winners keep winning.
No.
And yet you wrote a whole book about how you want to create opportunities for David to become Goliath.
Yeah.
So you should be rooting for David.
No. The book was an abstract exercise in understanding how a socially maladaptive outcome, the underdog winning, can be understood. That's all. Let me give you another.
That is not how I read it.
Last thing. Let me just explain to you how I first came to this understanding. What you are overstating is the degree of joy that accompanies an underdog's victory. The reason you're overstating it is you're forgetting the circumstances under which underdogs win. So I first and most clearly formulated this principle of rooting for the favorite during the 1976 Montreal Olympics, when Greg Joy, who was the overwhelming favorite to win the high jump, lost to a Polish guy, Wladek something, who was nothing, who was like not even a good. Why? Because it rained that day. And Greg Joy was a very technique-driven high jumper who needed absolute precision in his, when he planted his foot before he jumped. It was rainy and wet. His foot, he was slipping and sliding. He lost, and Wladek won, right? Now, Wladek, for the rest of his life, would look at his gold medal and say, well, I only really won this because it was raining.
Wait, no, hold on. No one ever thinks that way.
Oh, yeah.
No.
Oh, yeah. It was a tainted victory.
Hold on.
Tainted victory.
Yeah,
Wladek, even today, he looks at, he probably doesn't even have it in a case on his wall. He's probably got it tucked away because he's slightly ashamed of it. And his daughter says to him, Dad, how did you do in the 76 Olympics? And he says, I don't want to talk about it because it's a little.
I cannot let you get away with that. You have claimed that Ross and Nisbet gave you your worldview with the person in the situation, a book that they wrote based on their research on attribution theory, which showed very clearly and has shown for decades that human beings naturally attribute failures to external forces and successes to internal forces. So Wladek is going around thinking, I am the world's greatest high jumper, and not only that, I was able to be great on a day where it rained, when I was at a serious disadvantage. So eat that, Greg Joy.
I'm not going to change your mind. I can tell. It's fine. Go back to.
But are you going to change yours?
No.
You don't want the underdog to have a chance to just experience for a moment the joy of being on top.
It's tainted.
Well, I feel like this conversation is tainted then. No, this has been incredibly fun. Thank you for agreeing to join us, for sharing your bad advice, and your interesting ideas, and your wisdom, and your arguments that have inspired so many of us to ask more interesting, deeper, bigger questions. It's a real honor. I want to thank you, Malcolm, and thank all of you for being here.